This is Emirates Stadium, home to a very special football club that holds a place close to my heart. Hello, my name is Richard, and in this new video I'll be looking at the history and former home grounds of a club that has dominated my life for more than 45 years. This is the story of Arsenal FC. The club we know today as Arsenal FC was formed in 1886 by munitions workers from the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich. The club was originally named Dial Square FC after a workshop at the heart of the complex. Their first match was against Eastern Wanderers on the 11th of December 1886 and was played on the Isle of Dogs close to Glengall Road, now known as Tyler Road. Dial Square won 6-0. The club changed its name to Royal Arsenal in December 1886, rumoured to be on Christmas Day, and played their first home match on Plumstead Common on January 8, 1887, a 6-1 win over Erith. While today's home is a luxurious modern stadium, the club's first ground consisted of just a pitch with no stands or terracing and nothing in the way of facilities. In fact, the club used the nearby Star Inn pub as changing rooms. In September 1887, Royal Arsenal moved to a field in Plumstead Marshes, which was rather grandly known as a sportsman's ground after the nearby pub, and they would play here for 6 months. The site, which again was just a pitch with no stands, is now occupied by HMP Prison, Thameside. With the pitch at the sportsman's ground close to the River Thames, it was often liable to flooding, so the club moved to the adjacent Manor Field at the end of the 1887-1888 season. The first match there was on the 28th of March 1888 and resulted in a 3-0 win over Millwall Rangers. Like Sportsman's, the ground had no stands and only very basic facilities, and the club used the Railway Tavern as changing rooms. After a successful 1898 to 1890 season, Royal Arsenal moved again to the purpose-built Invicta ground, owned by local businessman George Weaver. This was the first proper stadium the club played in, and it coincided with Royal Arsenal becoming the first southern-based club to turn professional in 1891. The growth was rapid from here, and just 2 years later they were elected to the Football League Division 2, changing their name to Woolwich Arsenal. With a professional league club as tenants, Weaver attempted to increase the rent after a bid to buy the club himself had proved unsuccessful. But Woolwich Arsenal could not afford the rise and instead purchased their old ground at the Manor Field with money raised from a share issue. The site of the Invicta ground was demolished and became a housing estate, with some of the old terracing still visible in gardens on Hector Street. Back at the Manor, a stand and terracing were built and the site was renamed Manor Ground, ready to host the club's first ever match in the Football League on the 2nd of September 1893. It ended in a 2-2 draw with Newcastle United in front of a crowd of over 10,000 people. Finally settled, Woolwich Arsenal would remain at the Manor Ground for the next 20 years, apart from 2 matches in 1895, which we'll come on to now. Following crowd trouble during a match against Burton Wanderers in January of that year, the Football League shut the Manor Ground for 7 weeks, so the club played their subsequent home match against Burton Swift at New Brompton's Priestfield Stadium, now occupied by Gillingham FC, while the following home match against Leicester Fosse was played at Littleton Cricket Ground in Leighton. In 1904, Woolwich Arsenal was promoted to Division 1 for the first time in its history, and that year also saw a second stand added to the stadium. Built at what was previously the Abbey Wood End, this was the earliest known terrace to be named Spoyne Cop after the trenches in the Boer War. With the club now in the top flight, attendances began to hit the 20,000 mark, but the boom wouldn't last, and by the turn of the decade the club was in financial trouble and on the brink of bankruptcy. One of the reasons for this was an alarming drop in attendances due in no small part to the fact that the ground was extremely difficult to reach by public transport. In 1910, London property magnate and Fulham chairman Sir Henry Norris saved Woolwich Arsenal from bankruptcy, and after a failed attempt to merge the club with Fulham, he proceeded to move them across London to Highbury in 1913. The last match at the Manor Ground was on the 26th of April 1913 and ended in a 1-1 draw against Middlesbrough, watched by just 3,000 die-hard fans. Woolwich Arsenal had long been relegated, winning just 3 matches all season, so they would begin life in their new home, back in Division 2. The site of the Manor Ground, which roughly borders Nathan Way, Griffin Manor Way and Haddon Way, was developed into an industrial estate for several decades until it was demolished in 2016. It is now a residential development, Lombard Square, which opened in 2021. The land at Highbury, adjacent to Gillespie Road Underground Station, was originally the playing fields for St John's College of Divinity, and the club, now known simply as the Arsenal, leased it for £20,000. The stadium was hurriedly built over the summer of 1913 and designed by Archibald Leach, who had been the brains behind many football stadiums at the time, including Anfield and Ibrox Park, as well as designing the stands at the old Manor Ground. The new stadium cost £120,000 and was not fully completed in time for the first match against Leicester Fosse on the 6th of September. In fact, in a nod to the early days in Plumstead, the club had to use a local pub as changing rooms, and when a player was injured during a match, they were wheeled on a horse and cart to a nearby hotel to be treated. The first goal at the new stadium was in fact scored by Leicester's Jimmy Benfield, but it was George Joby who had the distinction of being Arsenal's first scorer at Highbury in a 2-1 victory. It wasn't all plain sailing for the club in the early years, though. Many local residents and neighbouring clubs, especially Tottenham Hotspur, still in Middlesex at the time, and Clapton Orient, protested against the move as they felt it would impact on their support. But slowly, the Arsenal adapted to their new surroundings. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 did not help as competitive football ceased a year later. But when it resumed for the start of the 1919 to 1920 season, the Arsenal was back in the top flight, although there was much controversy surrounding this. Without going into too much detail here, as it's a topic I've already covered on the channel in the Arsenal Oddity series from last year, it is fair to say something similar would not happen today. With the club back in the top flight, the stadium hosted its first England international in 1920, and in 1922 Rugby League was also played here. In 1925, the club bought the ground outright, now known as the Arsenal Stadium, for £64,000. And during the 1930s, as the club was rising to the very peak of English football under the innovative management of Herbert Chapman, the ground was completely redeveloped. The West Stand was designed in Art Deco style by Claude Waterloo Ferrier and William Burney and opened in 1932. Later that same year, with the club on the verge of winning the first of a hat-trick of league titles, Gillespie Road Underground Station was renamed Arsenal. The new East Stand, matching the West End design, opened in 1936 and went way over budget, largely due to the expensive and now world-famous street-facing facade you can see behind me. The North Bank Terrace was given a roof and a clock was erected at the southern end of the stadium, so the famous clock end was born. Floodlights were fitted in 1951 and undersoil heating added in 1964. Up until the Taylor Report in 1990, the stadium had a capacity of over 60,000, although the record attendance was in fact 73,295 for the visit of Sunderland on the 9th of March 1936. The match ended in a goalless draw. In a rather unique event, the final match before the outbreak of World War II in 1939, a 2-0 home win over Brentford, was used as a playing sequences for the movie The Arsenal Stadium Mystery, which starred manager George Allison and many of the players in supporting roles. After the 1930s reconstruction of the stadium, Highbury remained largely untouched for decades, proving how far ahead of its time it had been. In fact, it wasn't until the 1980s that any significant changes occurred. After a short-lived experiment in 1984, which saw the club erect a video screen at the clock end, the first in the country to show replays, the end of the stadium was finally redeveloped in 1988. A roof and 84 executive boxes was built and the new stand opened on the 2nd of January 1989 in head of a North London derby, which Arsenal won 2-0. However, the timing could not have been worse. Just 3 months later saw the Hillsborough disaster where 97 Liverpool fans tragically lost their lives at the FA Cup semi-final match against Nottingham Forest. The subsequent Taylor Report into the disaster ordered all top-flight clubs to convert to all-seater stadiums by 1995, and this would ultimately signal the end for Highbury. With no room for expansion due to the stadium being surrounded by houses and with the East and West Stand both now listed buildings, the capacity was dramatically cut. In fact, after the new 2-tier North Bank stand had opened in August 1993 and the stadium became all-seater later that year, the capacity had dropped to just 38,500. Had the clocking been developed into a 2-tier stand in 1988, it may have been possible to increase the capacity to around 45,000 and perhaps the club could have stayed at the Arsenal Stadium, but it wasn't to be. As Arsenal enjoyed more success into the 1990s and with football becoming ever more popular with the advent of the Premier League, every home match was a sellout with thousands on the waiting list for season tickets. In 1997, Arsenal looked into the possibility of moving to a bigger stadium, and a year later they stayed their Champions League home matches at Wembley Stadium. With crowds of around 70,000 for all 6 matches played there, the club knew they had outgrown Highbury. The previous year they had made a bid to buy Wembley and share it with the England national team, and when that failed, they turned their attention to a new site. Ashburton Grove had been an industrial waste disposal centre, but Arsenal bought the land in the year 2000, and the new 60,000 all-seater stadium, named Emirates after a long-term sponsorship agreement, opened in 2006. The last match at Highbury saw a 4-2 victory over Wigan Athletic on the 7th of May 2006, and Thierry Henry had the distinction of scoring a final goal at the stadium from the penalty spot. The victory saw Arsenal pip Tottenham Hotspur to the final Champions League spot, a certain sense of irony after Spurs had been one of the biggest protesters against a move to Highbury almost exactly 93 years previously. The ground was redeveloped into the Highbury Square residential estate, with the pitch turned into a communal garden and flats incorporated into the east and west stands. In the end, Arsenal had played 2,010 matches at the famous old stadium, winning 1,196, drawing 475 and losing 339. The ground also hosted 12 England internationals and 12 FA Cup semi-finals. And in 1965, it hosted the world heavyweight boxing title fight between Henry Cooper and Muhammad Ali, which Ali won. The new stadium was designed by Populous and built by Robert McAlpine at a cost of £390 million. As well as the stadium itself, a merchandise shop and club museum were also built on the site. The first match at the Emirates Stadium was a testimonial for Dennis Bergkamp against Ajax in July 2006, and the first official match was on the 19th of August, a 1-1 draw with Aston Villa on the opening day of the 2006-2007 season. Just like at Highbury, the first goal at the new stadium was scored by a visiting player from a Midlands club, in this case Aston Villa's Olaf Melberg, while the distinction of being the first Arsenal player to score there was Brazilian Gilberto Silva. Over the next few years, the club added some touches to help Arsenalise the stadium and bring a little of Highbury to the new ground. These included images of former players on the banners outside the stadium and white seats installed to show the traditional cannon. Meanwhile, the famous clock was eventually transferred to the south stand and the clock end was reborn. In 2011, to commemorate the club's 125th anniversary, statues of Arsenal greats Herbert Chapman and Thierry Henry were unveiled, while later statues of Dennis Bergkamp, Tony Adams and Arsene Wenger were also erected. The stadium has played host to matches for the Brazil national team and also rugby union internationals, while it's also been used as a live music venue for the likes of Bruce Springsteen, Green Day, Coldplay and The Killers. In 2022, the banners outside the stadium were updated to reflect the diversity of the club and to include images of the women's team as well as flags from all over the world. So the club has certainly come a long way since those humble beginnings south of the river at the end of the 19th century. From Plumstead Common to Sportsman's Ground, to the Manor Field, to the Invicta Ground, back to the Manor, onto Highbury, and then finally here to the Emirates. Not to mention those home matches played at Priestfield Stadium, Littleton Cricket Ground, and, of course, Wembley. Those munitions workers in Woolwich could never have imagined what the future would hold for their little works football team. Yes, it has been quite a journey. My name is Richard, and this has been a very special video looking at the history and home grounds of one of the biggest and most famous football clubs in the world. This has been the story of Arsenal FC. If you have enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, and why not consider subscribing to the channel? We not only bring you great coverage of the current matches and stories, both from the men's and the women's teams, but we also celebrate the rich history of this amazing football club. I'll be back very soon with more great Arsenal content, so be sure to join me for that next time.